Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Daska Discusses. You know, there is horror movies that we've seen over the years, the past 50, 60 years in film cinema history. And you may have people that you know that, I'm a big horror film fan, but there is one movie that I believe stands the test of time. One movie that I think is the horror film GOAT, as they say. And yes, it was made in 1973. But William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, based on his novel, is above anything made ever. Let's discuss it.
What an excellent day for an exorcism.
You'd like that?
Intensely.
The Exorcist. When I first saw it, let's talk about that. I was way too young. I remember vividly where I was. I was at a birthday party. I think it was like a 12th or 13th birthday party. I was grade 6. And during the day we had fun, playing games, footy, this and that. Then at night we decided to put some movies on. And I remember the first film we put on was The Puppet Master. Now it was my mate Michael Lavelle's birthday. And I'm like, The Puppet Master is a bit of a laugh. Then we chucked on Child's Play and, Chucky. Who doesn't laugh at Chucky? No big deal. Then at about 11:30 at night, the VHS cover of The Exorcist got pulled out, and I knew exactly what that was because going to the video shop as a kid, my parents never let me borrow it. My brother had borrowed it a few times with mates and watched it, but I was never, ever allowed to watch it, right? I remember as a kid, tried to even borrow the book from the library, and I reserved it, and the library back then sent out, or they used to give you a call, I think, saying, your book has arrived, and I remember the library called my house, and my mum picked up the phone and found out I wanted to read it, and she's like, no, you are not reading it. So I was 12 years old and we put on The Exorcist, and I'll tell you what, like the first probably 20 minutes of it, starts off in Iraq, we'll talk about it a bit later, I'm like, this is not scary, nothing much is happening, it's pretty boring, we're having a laugh, it was a slumber party, it was a sleepover. Then about 42 minutes in, when we first see Regan and her transformation begin, is when the SH1T got real for me as a kid, and I'll never forget when her eyes went all white. And now excuse my voice, I lost my voice at the footy the other day, go the Pies. I felt like there was something wrong, it went from laughing, watching her bounce up and down on the bed, to the white eyes and then that voice come through.
Keep away! The soul is mine!
Yeah, it was at that point a 12-year-old, which is not good, I'll tell you right now. It's definitely not good, but it was the 90s, and thinking back, the parents let my mate borrow this and we watched it. It was at that point where I'm like, okay, I'm actually scared. Now the movie went on, let's not go on and on about it, but I remember that night I didn't sleep. And I didn't sleep for a few months after. I really had issues with sleeping because all I kept thinking of wasn't like the whole demonic possession part. It was all the subliminal stuff, which we'll talk about later. But that was the first time I ever watched it. The second time I watched it, I was probably 15, 16, still borrowing stuff from the video shop. And I remember, and it was the school holidays. I remember I had the tape and I took it to my friend Chris's house, and myself, my mate Chris and George watched it. And being 16 years old is a lot different to when you're a kid. So I picked up on a lot more on the themes of everything. But again, all of us were like saying, this is not scary, but yet I still wouldn't really want to see certain scenes. So even at 16, it did affect me again, but not as bad, but still, I was still creeped out. We watched that during the day too. Then fast forward to the cinema release of The Exorcist, the version you'd never seen, and I was over 18 at this time, and I remember vividly going with the same mates to go and watch this. We all went there to the cinemas, and it was a packed cinema, and I always had this thing in my head about whether or not, what would it have been like in 1973 to be there to witness this film live on the, in that era, right? Watching it at the cinema in 2001 was an interesting experience. You had a lot of laughing here and there, from the audience, because obviously from 1973 till that time, there had been a plethora of demonic possession films, and there was probably people in there that had never seen it ever as well. Yet there were still people walking out, which was very interesting, especially after the crucifix scene. Yeah, and I can see why. So, and I managed to go, I think, twice to watch it at the cinemas, and I'll tell you what, it is still held up back then, and it still holds up now. So just recapping, at age 12, not a good idea to watch it, but it was pure nightmare fuel for me. Age 16, I started to understand some of the themes behind it, and then as an 18-year-old, I actually valued the cinematography, sound, everything that came together in that film. I'm like, you know what? I was getting heavily into film. I was at uni doing that kind of stuff too. And I was like, this is actually such a well-made film. And even now, it's in my top 5 films of all time, guys. Let's talk about the reputation of The Exorcist. You know, the thing is, guys, you got to remember 1973. If you go on YouTube or if you've got the DVD or the Blu-ray and you can have a look at what was happening during that time and the audience reactions, like have a listen here.
So scared the bed was shaking and legs were back.
She's going up and down.
And then when her voice changed, oh my God, I've never seen anything like
Did
it.
you see the part where she turns her head around?
Not yet. I'm not gonna see it either.
Yeah, that was...
Gross. What is that? Yeah, man, that is one of the most grossest movies in the world.
So people walking out, people fainting, people having heart attacks, a lot of things that happened during the screening of the film. Now, you could see why, guys. I mean, 1973, they had never seen anything like this. Just take a step back for a second before people judge and this generation sit there and go, oh, it's not even that scary. Well, we get it, but you got to think about it in the context of the time, guys. And, you know, I'm not going to talk about how big religion was then and now, but I'll tell you what, some of these scenes are very confronting, and the book itself is very confronting. Now, it wasn't just that, it was also, you know, the Exorcist curse happening during the making of the film, that all these people died, the sets went on fire, they got things blessed as well. William Friedkin was a bit erratic during the making of the film, firing guns to get reactions from Jason Miller, Father Karras. So there's a lot of things that went with this, and a lot of people that died during the making. Now you can say, you know, well, that happens on some films as well, just bad luck, but they reckon that the set was cursed. Who knows? But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about how it holds up and my nostalgic view of this. Now, when I saw the original version, I don't remember it vividly when I was 12, but I do remember the possession scenes, the crucifix scene, the doctors, you know, the medical scenes and all that. But looking at that and then comparing the original theatrical cut with the director's cut, obviously I think that the theatrical cut has a bit tighter pacing. It opens straight away to Iraq. Now, the director's cut, or the version never seen, starts off with that, you know, that tracking shot of the Georgetown street where Regan lives, and then a transition to a statue of the Virgin Mary, and just this ominous music in the background. And then the theme kicks in. Now, I love this. The soundtrack in this is amazing by Christoph Penderecki, and obviously Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, but just the way the film opens with the Iraq prologue. We'll talk about my favorite scenes later, but in terms of the differences between the two, there was that opening that I remembered when I saw it at the cinemas. I'm like, oh, that's new. The hospital scenes, there was a few more invasive things like the spinal tap, and there's a few more subliminal flashes of Pazuzu in that scene as well. The famous spider walk scene, which I remember in high school, a teacher talking about it, saying, oh, they deleted this one scene. This was in the 90s. They deleted this one scene because it was too graphic. But then in the original, in the director's cut, they actually put that in. And I was like, okay, cool. It's creepy, but, you know, you could see why maybe they didn't put it in. It just doesn't really fit. But it is a pretty cool sequence. But I guess in 1973, they couldn't really do it properly. But it is quite scary. The extra subliminal flashes of Pazuzu during the film, I think at the time, being a fan of the original version, you know, growing up watching it, like I said, I just thought, I think there's a few too many subliminal flashes of the face of Pazuzu, especially when Chris MacNeil comes back and realizes Bert Denning's dead. It's just like too many things happening, and I just think within the space of like a minute, there's just too many flashes of Pazuzu there. The longer conversation between Father Merrin and Karras on the stairs during the exorcism, I think worked well. I think it was really good because in the theatrical that was never there. The extended scene with Father Dyer and Lieutenant Kinderman at the end becoming friends, I think works well because it leads really well into The Exorcist 3. My point is, does the director's, you know, does the version you've never seen, is it better than the original version? Depends on what you grew up watching, I think. But for me, I mean, I grew up watching the original version, even though I only saw it a handful of times. Now I've seen the version you've never seen more. I do think the version you've never seen gives a bit more context and a bit more depth to a few scenes, but I just think the subliminal stuff, you know, the CG that they kind of inserted in here and there, not too much CG, but Spider Walker just feels like, what are we doing here? Like kind of like The Conjuring, but it's just leave it alone. But Friedkin didn't, and I'll accept that. So that's what I want to say about that. Let's talk about why The Exorcist feels so real when you watch it, okay? Now, I talk about genre tropes in class, to my year 11s about horror, and you've got low-key lighting, the menacing music, and the settings that are all scary, but The Exorcist does something different. The way Friedkin makes it feel like realistic through this documentary-style filmmaking, natural lighting, some handheld camera, no Hollywood gloss. The casting is mostly unknowns. The slow, mundane first half feels like, Chris MacNeil and Regan, you feel the stress of her being a parent, trying to work out what's wrong with her kid. And I think that's why the first 40 minutes or so, kind of like people think, oh, this is boring or whatever. No, it's not, because it's actually just building on what's going on. Instead of jumping straight to, oh, she's possessed by a demon. No, she goes to the doctors, does all these tests, and they're quite graphic in terms of like showing how it all gets done. It's a real medical nightmare when you think about it, like the, putting the dye in her and all the machinery going off. It's quite confronting as well when you watch it. And as a kid, you're like, oh man, this is full on, because they're like trying all these tests and they still don't know what's wrong with it. I mean, the audience kind of have an idea. It's got this overall realistic tone to it. That's what William Friedkin does in all his films. It gives it this realistic documentary-esque type of tone. And I just think it works really well in this. I mean, apart from maybe the levitating at the end and all that. But yeah, you got to remember that, Friedkin took this from William Peter Blatty's novel and he converted it into a film. Now, there are a lot of things in the book that aren't in the film, and there was a few things that they disagreed with, but I still think that Friedkin's filmmaking makes this film. I can watch this film now, and I'm not even like, you watch it and you think, you're always picking up on things that you missed. Try to explain to friends that why I love this film. They're like, oh, it's scary, it's stupid, or it's like too scary, I'm not watching it. But I watch it and I just marvel at the cinematography and the way it's edited. I just think it's fantastic. It makes you feel like you're there, and these characters make you feel like you're there, which is which is what I'm getting into next. So the reason why Friedkin's cinematography and the way he shoots everything is because of the characters. Now, the characters themselves, I think the key ones in the film, we'll talk about it now. Obviously, Regan MacNeil, 12-year-old girl, Linda Blair, starts with this whole medical symptoms that feel like, maybe it's puberty, maybe it's something else, we don't know, then turning into this demonic possession. Her performance in this film is fantastic. I know the voice of the demon wasn't Linda Blair, it was Mercedes McCambridge as well, and I don't even know if she's credited in the film. In the credits, I've got to check that, but I think there was a bit of a dispute about that, what a voice she had as well. Chris MacNeil, played by Ellen Burstyn, the successful single mum, the actress, she struggles with a lot of different things in her life, guilt obviously, but she's working hard and she doesn't know what's going on with her daughter. She carries an emotional weight in this film. Father Karras, Jason Miller, I'll tell you what, the themes in this isn't just good and evil, it's also like a family tale in terms of Chris and her daughter, but also Father Karras and his mum. Now, him being Greek and his mother being Greek too added another layer of like emotion and me in complete fear as a kid, because when the demon starts speaking in Greek in Father Karras' mum's voice, I kind of freaked the hell out, because I'm like, oh no, this movie's like getting too close to home for me. I just think Father Karras' character is so underrated. His struggle, belief, and in his faith, he tells his mate Tom, he goes, I think I'm losing my faith. And it ends in the ultimate redemption in the self-sacrifice of himself. Father Karras' mother, she only appears briefly, and her off-screen death haunts the whole film. I mean, the poor lady died alone and neglected. And again, one of my scariest images is when in the middle of the possession where Father Karras walks in and he sees, not Regan, but he sees his mother sitting there in like white kind of clothes, like she's from the hospital or the mental hospital where he put her. And I think that's one of the most scariest images I've ever seen. I know it's just an old lady sitting on a bed, but just the way she's lit, the dark circles around her eyes, it is the scariest thing. Then you got Max von Sydow, who plays Father Lancaster Merrin, and again, I mean, I don't know if Don's going to talk about this, but that opening scene in Iraq, we'll talk about that, but he knows something's up. He pulls out that little rock in the statue, opens it up, and the look on his face when he sees it, he knows that evil is coming back. Did he fight evil before? Yes, he did, because they do mention it later on in the film that he was in Africa digging things up, and that's where the Exorcist Dominion prequel came into it and all that. But I just think that for his screen time, Max von Sydow does own it. and he was only like 35 years old, and he's playing a 65-year-old, which means that the makeup effects by Dick Smith were fantastic in this. And if you haven't watched the making of the film, there's so many different ones. There's The Fear of God. There's a whole bunch of them on different Blu-rays and DVDs. They're definitely worth a watch. You know, you got to think about it, guys. I'll touch on the themes now briefly, but the thing is, you got to remember, in the 70s, it was like all this stuff that happened with, you know, post-Vietnam distrust in the government and everything, the shifting family values, the loss of like religion in the world as well. This film took place during that time, okay? So the whole thing about faith versus science, where the mum, you know, Chris MacNeil's taking her kid to the doctors, they're doing all these tests, and they still can't figure out what's going on. So they're like, you know, have you heard of an exorcism? And it's just a bizarre thing to think back then, because she's completely at a parental loss of like, here we go.
Lesion in the temporal lobe. It's a kind of seizure disorder.
Look, Doc, I really don't understand how her whole personality could change.
The temporal lobe is very common.
So the doctors keep telling them it's a temporal lobe, it's this and that. We'll try different things, so you can see how back in the 70s they're like, well, how would anyone deal with this? So that's why this film is so good, like that sense of realism. Like any parent will be going to the doctors to see what's going on, but they can't work it out. Let's not forget that the slow progression of what happens to Regan. You know, you can look at the whole scene where, oh, where did you get this? You know, the Ouija board. Now, did it all stem from this Ouija board? That's what a few people think as well, you know, Captain Howdy. You know, the start of the film, you had the statue of Pazuzu, okay? You know, Father Merrin looking at that statue, knowing that evil's coming. But then for some reason, it ends up in this house in Washington across the world. Why is that? I'm not going to sit here and talk about all that, but just let's talk about the progression of Regan turning into Pazuzu. Obviously, she's been talking to Captain Howdy through the Ouija board, which is creepy. As the movie goes on, the noises in the attic that she hears, and then someone's actually desecrated a Virgin Mary statue in the church. Now, the question is, was that Regan? Did she happen to go out and do that? I don't believe so. I like to think of it as maybe someone else off screen obviously someone else off screen has done this desecration because they know that evil's up in the area or in the world at that time, right? Then you've got, you know, Regan goes to the doctor and she's acting a bit funny.
Can you feel this?
I don't feel anything.
Yeah, so she's acting a bit funny at the doctor's. So this was in the director's cut as well. So progression, right? And then obviously you've got, as the movie goes on, she's got the party scene where she comes down and says to the astronaut the following line, which again used to freak me out a little bit because it is a bit weird. But she doesn't look demonic, she's just normal. Here we go.
You're gonna die up there.
And then she urinates on the rug, which again, at the time when you first see it, you laugh as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old. You're like, haha, that's funny. But it's actually not when you see what's happening next with the bed that's shaking and all that. They come back and then the mum freaks out. One of the scariest sequences, or most memorable ones for me, is when Father Karras, his mum's just died, and now he's having this dream. Now, I remember this 100% when I was 12, 13 years old. He has this dream that he's on the road, on a street, there's like flashing dogs and his mum, and the clock ticks, and then his mum is walking up from a subway, okay? From the subway stairs. He's across the road, he's waving at her, waving at his mum, and just the soundscape here. And then she's looking at him, she says his name, and then this flash. It's the first time we see Pazuzu's face, and it's like very brief. That subliminal flash stayed with me for a long, long time. I kept thinking about it. I even had mates that were like, oh, maybe we should rewind it. You know, we did when I was like 16, and it didn't really bother me. I didn't want to see it, but when I was 12 and I saw that subliminal flash, yeah. So I reckon 47 minutes in, and then afterwards, yeah, you got Regan at the doctor's. They're giving her an injection and she starts swearing. I'm not going to play that bit, but I think this is where the movie escalates big time. And then, like I said earlier, you've got the bit where she's bouncing up and down on the bed and the eyes go in the back of the head. And then she goes back to the doctors and they tell her, you know, to keep any drugs in your house. I remember laughing at that. But then she comes back. Chris MacNeil comes back. Bert Dennings has been babysitting her because Kitty had to go out or something like that, which I remember as a 16-year-old thinking, why would you leave Bert Dennings, that drunk guy, with that little girl? And we find out that Bert Dennings is dead because he fell down the stairs, apparently, outside M Street. Now we know what actually happened. He was pushed out the window, because then we get to meet Lieutenant Kinderman. Now, this is where I was saying where it's just a bit too many subliminal shots here and there of Pazuzu's face. Now, she goes into Regan's room and she sees that the window is completely open. And then we get the reveal from one of Chris's friends that Bert Dennings has been killed. Yeah. And then they've got the bit where it gets a bit escalated, which is a spider walk sequence.
Oh my God.
Yeah. I just think maybe that the spider walk sequence could have been a bit much for that whole sequence, that whole scene, because you've got so many things happening and then bang, this spider's walk sequence happens. I think it was too much, but it does work. It's an extra scare, okay? And this leads to obviously one of the most controversial scenes of all time, which is obviously, Kinderman comes in to speak to Chris MacNeil. He's a big fan of the film, but they talk about what was happening the night of Bert Dennings' murder. It's what happens after he leaves is where this film, I think the most controversy happens, and what people tend to remember the head turning around and the puke and all that, but I think the crucifix scene, and I'm not going to get into detail about it because, it is quite graphic, but I remember even in the book reading it, it's just so visceral. And I think when people think and when people ask why it's so controversial and so scary or psychologically damaging to people and why people can't watch it, it's because of this scene. And I'm not even going to play any of it because it's just too violent, vile, and you can see why a lot of old people, well, not even old people, but even my grandparents, when they had heard about the film, and I remember they were immigrants from Greece, but they knew about the film and this specific scene, it is really sacrilegious as well, and it is so full on. But like William Peter Blatty said, he needed a scene, he needed something in the book to make Chris MacNeil want to go to the priest, because at this point she's just thinking about all the medical stuff. This was that point, that crucifix scene, and I still to this day can't watch that scene without really just not looking away, but I just can't, I can watch it, but it's just too much. Now I know you're thinking, well, Daska, there's so many other films. You can have your Saw and your Conjuring and all that stuff, but that one little bit, I know there's heaps of extreme horror films, but we're talking about mainstream Hollywood here, guys. We're not talking about random things I'm not even going to name those dodgy movies that back at uni people used to tell me to watch, but we're talking about mainstream Hollywood, and we're talking about the 1970s. To have that scene from the book that's in that with what's happening and with the age of the girl, I know it wasn't her doing what she was doing, but seriously, just take a step back and think about if you were in 1973 and you saw that. No wonder it freaked people out.
You know what she did?
Yeah, so I just think that one scene, that specific scene just conjures up all sorts of bad memories, but also vividness and just where cinema can push the limits, and I think that did that. Now, like I just said, I'm not going to repeat myself, it's not one of those B-grade gore films that you see all over the internet, whatever, but this was mainstream Hollywood, so remember that when you're a Gen Y or Z or whatever thinking that this movie's not scary. It's all about the context which it was produced. You guys have seen things like The Conjuring and all those other possession films that are out. This was the first, and it did it to the extreme. The poster itself, guys, is iconic. It's in cinematic history. I think it is one of the top 5 iconic posters, and it's based on a painting as well. I heard that William Friedkin based it off. But that one shot of The Exorcist, Father Merrin standing there looking up at the window and then cross-cutting to Regan's face, something bad's going to happen. The whole movie's been built to this point. Father Merrin comes in, and you're expecting some sort of typical horror film kind of dark, scary house. But no, it's a normal house. I think that's what makes this movie so scary, is that it's just a normal house with people in it, and it's well lit, and it just feels real. And then he walks in, and you're like, Father Karras, he's here? Yeah, here we go.
Father Karras. It's an honor to meet you, Father.
And then we've got the last half an hour from here, which is the exorcism part, where I like the part where Father Merrin's telling him the demon's a liar, he's a liar, do not believe him and do not listen.
Especially important is the warning to avoid conversations with. We may ask what is relevant, but anything beyond that is dangerous. He's a liar. The demon is a liar. He will lie to but he will also mix lies with the truth. The attack is psychological, Damien. So don't listen. Remember that. Do not listen.
It is a great sequence, but I'm just going to make a hot take here, guys, is that I'll tell you right now, I'm more of a fan of probably the first hour of the film, the slow burn, the build-up, etc., the medical tests and the fact that, she's bouncing up and down on the bed and then the eye roll and the crucifix scene. I think I'm more of a fan of that than this whole sequence here. This exorcism sequence, yes, it is memorable, and the head turning around and all the swearing, which I'm not going to play too much, and some of the imagery in this is quite frightening as well, but her head turning around.
Amen.
But some of the subliminal stuff in her face that you see when it goes between Regan and the Pazuzu imagery as well is quite scary. But hot take for me is that I think I like the first hour of the film better. But like I said, this is an iconic film and I love all of the film. I know it sounds weird, not really weird, but I value this film for what it's done to history. And as years go on, I watch it and I'm like, I can fully appreciate the filmmaking and the story itself, which is why it's in my top 4 on my letterbox, because it is the GOAT horror film. But it's more than just a horror film. It's, supernatural. It's all about science, all about faith. There's a lot of themes, undercurrent themes in this. And for people to just be like, for all over TikTok and Instagram, it's like, what's the scariest movie ever? And then it's labeled as that and people bag it by saying it's actually not that scary. I really disagree with that, because it depends on when you watched it, how you watched it, and the fear behind when you watched it. Obviously now some kid's going to watch it and think this is not scary at all because they've seen other things that in their mind is scary. I get that, but
Look down in pity.
You killed your mother.
Your servant.
You left her alone to
Regan,
die. Shut
Regan.
up! I'll never forgive you.
Shut
up!
okay, let's talk about some iconic scenes for me. The opening, right? The first opening credits with the Muslim prayer, call to prayer, and the sunrise and the excavation and everything. There is something not just about this opening, but also when we meet Merrin, when he opens up the statue and he sees what's going on, and then he just walks around all of Iraq and he gets to this other archaeological dig and he looks up at the statue. He's walking up this mound and he sees this statue of Pazuzu, and the soundtrack, everything, and the editing between this and the dogs that he sees fighting. You ready? Slow zoom in to the Pazuzu face, and then it goes to this wide shot of both of them standing looking at each other. And it transitions to the sunset. I just think that the first 10 minutes of the film are iconic, and they're one of the best openings of a film ever, right? Now, a lot of people, when they watched it, I remember as a kid, like I said, you're like, what is this movie? Did we even put the right movie on? But it's, when you watch it again when you're older, it just hits a lot different. But I just think that is an iconic scene for me, one. Iconic scene number 2 for me is definitely Damien Karras' dream, and we talked about that earlier, where the first glimpse of Pazuzu, that scared the ever-loving crap out of me as well. I think that is an iconic scene where, it's just, the subliminal scares you, okay? Iconic scene number 3 is definitely the crucifix scene, and the bit which is, that's a really full-on. You can put that in with the bouncing on the bed, the Sow is mine scene, but the top 2 for me got to be the opening and that dream sequence, and obviously those other 2, but not as much. But that's what I believe. The soundtrack, let's talk about the soundtrack a bit. There's not much of a soundtrack, but the main one that we can talk about is Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, when Chris MacNeil's walking home. This is known as the theme of The Exorcist, but it's only played in this sequence, and then in the final credits. The rest of the film is by Krzysztof Penderecki, Polymorphia. A lot of like atmospheric type of like strings, and they use a bit of this in The Shining as well. I'll play this video. So just these like very vivid, strong, kind of powerful, discomforting soundtrack. You got to give it to William Friedkin, man. The way he also, the set design in this and turning that Regan's room into like pretty much a freezer to get that breath. It was pretty groundbreaking filmmaking for its time, and Dick Smith for his makeup effects and for all the stunts and all that. I think even Ellen Burstyn actually hurt herself in that crucifix scene. She actually hurt her back, which I think if you watch the making of it, they were talking about the stunt coordinators and they're like, yeah, give it to her, and they pulled her really hard and she actually hurt herself. I actually felt sorry for her because they were kind of like joking about it. So there is one way you can look at this and think, you know what, it's pretty harsh how they treated her back then. And that's one little thing that I didn't like about the making of the film, was the fact that she actually got hurt and they were laughing about it back then. But then again, the 70s. Now let's talk about why it still works today. I might have touched on this before, but there's no jump scare reliance in this film. I don't think there's hardly any jump scares apart from the phone ringing at one point when Karras turns to, the phone rings and he turns his head. It's psychological disturbance over cheap scares, alright? So most horror wants to scare you. This one wants to disturb you, I read, right? And that's a really good quote, and it still does. The legacy of The Exorcist is that it elevated horror back then to serious cinema. Like, it was treated like crap, let's just be honest. I mean, you had, elevated horror into serious cinema, got a Best Picture nomination, for God's sake. And the influence that it had on pop culture after that, I know, they made Repossessed as a comedy version, but things like, I've said The Conjuring, Hereditary, there's a whole bunch of films that it left its cultural footprint, and that's massive. That's what's still massive, is that whenever you talk about possession films, and whenever people want to compare it, they go back to The Exorcist. They do, alright? Not only was it a great novel, it was also a great film. Now, we're not going to talk about the sequels much, but part 2, in my mind, wasn't the best at all. I think part 3 is low-key one of the most greatest detective films ever made, but again, it's when I explain it to friends like, oh, you should watch part 3, the ones that aren't horror fans are like, nah, I can't sit through another movie like that, too gross for me. But part 3 is actually fantastic. Then you've got the prequel with its multiple versions, which I wasn't a huge fan of, and then you've got the reboot Believer, which I don't even want to talk about it because of just how disappointed I was with that. And now they're doing another reboot, whatever. Let's talk about the TV show. I thought the TV show started off okay, then kind of went nowhere, and they ended that. So the word and the whole, the lore of The Exorcist has been going on for 50 plus years, guys, but they just can't get it right. Even though you want to remake other films or make your own versions of it, the OG, The Exorcist, is never going to go away. And even with this reboot, I don't know if Scarlett Johansson's in it or whatever, but I don't know. I just don't see it happening in this day and age. If you were to ask me, hey, Daska, could this be made today, right? Just wrapping things up. I really don't know because of the amount of brain rot, for lack of a better word, that's out there, but also the fact that this generation, in terms of sitting there through a slow burn film like this and to get these types of scares when so many audiences have seen so many similar things, I don't think it would work. We'll see what happens with that reboot. I mean, there's so many different demonic movies out there. People look possessed. They all look the same. The voice of Mercedes McCambridge as well. You can't replicate that. You can't catch this great filmmaking, great director, great novel, actors, everything in this film. It's not just a horror film, it's something you experience and maybe something that stays with you. I know that it stayed with me for many years, but I think that's the whole thing of the film, is that, it may have lost its whole, is it scary or not? It's not I think if you're looking at it from that perspective, I really think that The Exorcist is one of the greatest films ever made. Not because of the whole possession stuff, but like I've been saying, guys, the story, the way it's told, the editing, the cinematography, it has this unnerving psychological undercurrent that can play on your head, especially if you're religious. But even if you're not, to see what you see on the screen, especially some of those key scenes, is quite brutal and it will never leave your memory. I've got friends that won't watch this ever again after they saw the version you've never seen. I just want to say, guys, this has been one of my favorite episodes to record because it is in my top 5 films of all time, and it is a film that gets the recognition for good and bad reasons, because people are always trying to say it's not the scariest film, but it's not about whether it's the scariest film. Does it get under your skin, and is it important for cinema? Yes, it is. This is one of the greatest films of cinema history, and you can't change my mind with that, guys, because The Exorcist will be always remembered as the GOAT horror film. I don't care what you say. Just want to say thank you guys for listening, and don't forget to follow on Spotify, and remember,
The power of Christ helps you.
gotcha. See you later, guys. Bye.